All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. You can see my screen? Yeah, cool. All right. So welcome to start with a question, finish with an inquiry project. I'm Jay Sorensen. I'm the Ed Tech Coordinator in the Oxnard Union High School District and also the President of Gold Coast Q. And with me is Mike Volmert, who was temporarily retired and right now is the Interim Executive Director of Q and also the Vice President of Gold Coast Q. And in our district, as we started to move one-to-one, Mike and I did a series of trainings, which began with what we affectionately refer to as Mike's rant. And so he is going to start this off with a mini version of his rant. So
it will be short. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I just want to talk a little bit about framing the paradigm and the view that we have of the shift that's taken place over the last few years in teaching and learning, and all of the challenges and all of the real stressors from the pandemic. One thing that the pandemic has done for us that isn't going to go away is that by and large, districts have now provided all of our students with a internet connected mobile device, which in spite of the fact that that was the vision in the National Technology Plan in 2008, it's taken a long time for a lot of districts to be able to get there. So if we can call that a benefit, and I think in some aspects we can, here's the sort of thinking that has driven us to share these ideas with the teachers that Jay and I have been working with. And I want to start this off just by saying we're at a fork in the road now, and we've got a tremendous opportunity to make some differences for our students in ways that have been challenging or maybe not really possible in the past. And there's a couple very subtle reasons for that. So in the words of that great philosopher, Yogi Berra, who is actually known more as a Hall of Fame catcher for the New York Yankees than his philosophy, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. As we move out of the pandemic and all of the issues that we've had to wrestle with for that, and students come back to school and we start working face-to-face with our kids again, we're at a fork in the road. We can go back to the same practices and the same sorts of things that we've done for the last 100 years and all of the little minor iterations that we've done, or we can take a different look at what our role in the classroom actually is and what our role in working with our kids actually is. So this talk is about some ideas and a very straightforward sort of way to move along that fork in the road. And the main premise for this is a very simple but really important concept. Historically, teaching was about content. Teaching was about sharing information with our students in what we would consider logical or systematic ways that would allow students to assimilate some sort of content that we want to present them with. And in the words of Seymour Papert, the amount of information that's available to our students and to anybody really in the world now because of the internet it is huge compared to the amount of information that we can actually impart to our students. And we can quibble all we want over what parts of that huge store of information is most important and what parts of that we need to impart to our kids. But the reality is, unless we know what information is important for our kids in their futures, in their endeavors when they're out of our school system, we may or may not hit that mark. And it's very, very likely that we're going to miss that mark because we don't know what our kids are going to do when they leave our school system. So that creates both a challenge and an opportunity. But the reality is that it's almost all opportunity. Jay, you want to switch slides? If you've been teaching for more than 10 years, then the world that you grew up in the world that you got trained to be a teacher in, and the world that you worked with your students in was a world where information was a scarce commodity. There were basically three places in a school where students could access information. The most important of those was the teacher. The teacher was by far the most reliable, most adaptable, and most timely source of information in the classroom. The second source was the textbook. And the textbook is dated. It's structured in ways that we don't want to use all of the information there. We want to pick and choose. We may have other information in terms of content that we feel is more important than what's in the textbook. And debates just were abundant about how the textbook matched what it is we wanted to do in our classroom. And then we had arguments about, well, ditch the textbook and all of that kind of stuff. But the challenge was that that textbook was a very important source of information in our classroom. The third one is the library. And the library, as great as it is hugely limited in practical ways for what we can do with our students in class for two reasons. If we have our students working on a similar topic and we've got, say, 30 kids, there aren't 30 copies of every source that the kids need to access. So now we have to change what we're doing, and we can't go to the library every day because we have to share that resource with all the other teachers on campus. So now we schedule it, and then we turn the library into the focus of the exercise instead of the kids actually focusing on learning skills and doing meaningful work and even finding the particular sources of information that we're interested in. Now, if you've been teaching less than 10 years, you grow up in a world where information has become like air. It's ubiquitous. It's out there. It's easy to access. It's very easy to find the information sources that we need. And you can even have every kid in your class working on the same source of information at exactly the same time. So unlike the textbook or the library, this ubiquitous aspect of information is the world that you grew up in. But if you've been teaching for 10 years, you've been evaluated and trained by people who grew up in a world where information was scarce. And sometimes that creates a little antagonistic relationship, some challenges, because while we want to do certain things, we didn't have the resources. Not every kid had access to a laptop all the time, which means they didn't have access to the internet all the time. And it created some compromises. Those compromises are gone. We now have our kids in a position where ubiquitous access to information is a reality, and it fundamentally changes the primary role that we can assume in the classroom. And that's the crux of the argument that Jay and I want to present for changing what it is we want to focus on with our students in the classroom. And the short story is, we don't want to focus on content. Content is not the relevant piece of work that we can do with our kids. It's in different places. Next slide, Jay. This is the world that we live in. This is the world we as teachers live in. All of us in a social fabric live in this world, and our schools, our students live in this world. It's a world surrounded by change, and it's a world surrounded by challenges. And these are the things that dominate our thinking as we try to navigate our way through our individual lives and our passions and our interests and our world of work. In Finland, a couple decades ago, they started having this conversation because Finland realized that they only had three resources to be a viable economic entity. Number one was reindeer. That ain't gonna work forever. Number two is trees. That's not gonna work forever. And number three is people. And if people and innovation is gonna be the primary driver of your economic system, then education becomes paramount. And the Finns adopted a different thinking process in terms of how they approach this. And we're suggesting that this is really worth us doing some introspective work on. And so next slide, Jay. This is what the Finns developed. And they started focusing on seeing their students not as repositories for a bunch of content and information that we kind of pour into them. They looked at their students as individuals who needed to be skilled in learning things that we don't even know they need to learn yet. And so they started focusing on what they call, and I love this term, transversal competencies. And these transversal competencies are the things that if we develop this in all of our students, we can be confident that whatever it is that they want to work on in their future, they will be able to do that at a very high level. And if you look at these transversal competencies, they all center around helping people develop both as individuals and as a member of society. But there's one thing, if you look at this carefully, that's not part of the Finnish curriculum. It's content. There's no math, no language arts, no history, no science. It's not part of the curriculum. Now, does this mean that the students don't work on this stuff? Absolutely not. But as they work on those various topics, those various pieces of content, the focus is always on those transversal competencies, those learning skills. Jay, next slide. So we're suggesting that we adopt the same focus. We now, because we're not the central disseminator of information in our classrooms, have the ability to change our role and focus with our students on helping them become very effective learners and using the content that we have a passion for and that we're interested in as sort of the context for kids working on these skills. And the argument, just like the Finns, is if students are engaged and students are focusing on their learning skills, they will apply those skills to whatever it is that we ask them to work on. And as they do that, they will assimilate the reality of that content much more effectively than in our traditional way of just sort of breadcrumbing things along and allowing our students to take a more or less passive role in the work that they do. So the transversal competencies that we suggest are important to us at this point are in two arenas. And the first one is research skills. Our kids need to know how to take something they don't know anything or much about, find information about that, make sense of that information, and then how do they formulate meaning and share that learning with others? So that's a three-step process that has to do with basically doing research. Something happened there. Okay, we're good. So this ability to find information, to curate that information, because we're going to find a lot of information, but it's not all going to fit with our vision of what it is that we want to do. So that curation process, taking the pertinent information and sort of setting aside the ancillary information for the time being, and then formulating meaning out of that, is a very, very critical skill for our students to have, especially since we've got no idea what it is that they're going to need to learn in their adult life. We don't know, but we do know two things. Number one, they're going to need to learn things in their adult life. And number two, that amount of learning and what they need to learn is going to change greatly over the time that they spend in their adult life. Now, research skills is the skills part of what we think is really important. But there are also some attributes that we need to help our students to develop. Some of those attributes are what we've called in the past the 4 C's: creativity, communication, critical thinking, and collaboration. We know that those are important. We know why those are important. I've added what I think is a 5th attribute that needs to be part of this conversation, and that's a growth mindset. If our kids believe that if they just stick with it, the old Finding Nemo idea of just keep swimming. If that is the mindset that our kids have, we know that they'll be successful. So these attributes and these skills have to be, in our minds, central to the conversation that students have every day in every class with every topic that they're working on. It does a couple things. It breaks down the sort of siloed aspect of what we see, especially in middle school and high school. And it allows the kids to focus through their entire day on these skills and attributes, and then just change the content or the context of what it is that they're working on. Next slide, Jay. So this is a fundamental change in how we think about education. And it's a fundamental change in what we think of as our role in our classroom, but it's a critical one for our kids. Will Richardson wrote about that a few years ago now. And the traditional thought about education had a few caveats to it, and I'll share a couple. But there's a link here to an article that I highly suggest you read called 9 Elephants in the Room That Should Unsettle Us. But historically, we've thought about education as basically our best guess at what we have to do to our kids, not with our kids, what we have to do to our kids so that they can meet some arbitrary set of standards and outcomes, which is what Papert refers to as us quibbling over which 1/100000th of 1% of information all of our students need to have. Richardson also wrote a book. It's a couple bucks, available on Kindle, called Why School. And it's a very short read, but if you don't want to read it, there's also a TED Talk where he outlines these ideas. And I highly, highly suggest that you take a look at these. They've been really helpful in helping to sort of frame this paradigm shift from us as disseminators of information to us as facilitators of learning skills. Next slide, Jay. So there's a couple aspects to what we argue we should be moving towards. And there's some resources that we want to share that we highly recommend that you take a look at. The first one is Sonny Magana's book, Disruptive Classroom Technologies. In that, he presents a very logical and intuitive framework for moving from our traditional modes of using technology in the classroom and working with our students into a mode that basically helps us get into a student-centered, inquiry-based classroom environment. And spoiler alert, as you read this, there are 3 stages to this evolution, going from just basically using the technology as a tool to do the same stuff that we've already done or always done, into what he calls a transformational stage, which is now starting to focus on student-centered work. As soon as you can get your classroom into the T2 stage, the better. You want to get there as quickly as you can. And then moving into the T3 stage is going to take, it's going to take some work, because it's different working in a student-centered, inquiry-based classroom than it has been with our traditional vision of what we do. So we highly recommend this book. We highly recommend this as a framework to sort of start on that journey. Next slide, Jay. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So as I mentioned, Mike and I worked with teachers in my district as we were looking to go one-to-one, and we really liked using the T3 framework for setting that up, because we had many teachers before then that were at T0 because they didn't have access to technology and hadn't really done anything using technology in their classrooms. So getting them to T1 is great, but using tools, like Edpuzzle, which do that automation and consumption and give students immediate feedback, and that's all great. We wanted to emphasize that's not the end goal. So, for many of them, moving to T1 was a big shift. But like Mike was saying, getting to T2, that shift from teacher-centered to student-centered is a big shift. Some of you might have seen Sunny's keynote yesterday and maybe even attended his sessions after that. But he talks about in the T3 level, where you're doing the inquiry design and social entrepreneurship, of getting students to solve wicked problems. So one area or one idea for solving wicked problems are the global goals for sustainable development, which come from the UN. We really like these. It's a great starting point for a project. The website has a whole bunch of resources and goes into depth into each of these global goals. But it's a great place to start, and it doesn't necessarily have to be solving an actual global problem. It could be solving that at a community level, a school level, a classroom level. So it can be used with a lot of different grade levels. But this is a great resource, and we're going to look at it a little bit more in a second.
And the subtle shift here is, instead of focusing on my science class and focusing on the science, if I put kids to work on any one of these 17 sort of challenges and tell them that we need to mix that with the science about it, or the history about it, or the rhetoric, the conversations that people have, and the literature that's written about this kind of stuff, and use those as sort of the context for how the kids work on these problems. This is how we mix our content into the students actually focus on this problem solving challenge.
And another great resource, there's the Right Question Institute, which was started by Dan Rothstein and Lou Santana, who wrote a book, Make Just One Change, getting students to ask their own questions. Essentially, this book is an in-depth look at something called the question formulation technique, QFT, which is something that we're big fans of and we've done in our trainings as well. The goal of the QFT is to get students to ask better questions. And it's really a great sort of first step if you're looking to start to do inquiry projects. So we said, start with a question and finish with the project. So getting kids to start asking questions and then potentially seeking answers to those questions that they're interested in. You can start small and then get bigger, and we'll talk about that. And you can use these questions that they come up with, the individual student can, or you can use these for bigger class projects. So the QFT essentially is a protocol that the teacher is just sort of facilitating, leading the students through. I mentioned it's a great first step, both for teachers and students. For the teacher, it's nice because you're just sort of facilitating this process. The only thing you need to do is come up with a question focus, which is the subject of where the questions will be coming from. And then you're just taking them through this process. For students, it's also very accessible because they just have to come up with any questions that come to their mind. So you start with a question focus or a Q focus. This can be just about anything. It could be a quote, it could be a short video, it could be an image, it could be a piece of art, it could be a simulation, just about anything. You don't want it to be too large, but something that gets students asking questions. This can be a great way to launch a new unit that you're doing. So students are coming in asking questions and thinking about it already. It could be a way to wrap up a unit, and it could be a way to maybe kick off a project. So you start with this question focus that you present to the students, and then the students are going to start producing questions. They're to follow these 4 rules. Ask as many questions as you can. Don't stop to discuss, judge, or answer. Usually it's done, when you're able to do it in person, it's usually done in groups, and there's one recorder per group, and they're to write down the questions exactly as they're stated by the people in their group. Unless it's a statement, then they ask them to change it into a question. We're going to do it virtually here, so it will be done a little bit differently. So you go over the rules with the students. You talk about why those rules are important. We want to hear everyone's voices. This is that divergent thinking where we can get a lot of different ideas. The person who's recording them is to number the questions, because then you come back to some of the question numbers later. You then work to improve the questions, and you do that by first categorizing them as open-ended or closed-ended questions, which gets them thinking about their questions a little bit. And then you take one of each and convert it to the other. So one open to closed and one closed to open. You then come up with priority questions as a group. When you've chosen those priority questions, you then talk about next steps for finding answers to those questions, and then you reflect back on the process. So we are going to go ahead and do one right now, but because we're not in person in groups, we're going to do it virtually using a Padlet. So this is one way that you can do the QFT if you're not able to be in person and writing on, like chart paper in groups, which again, we'd recommend is probably the ideal way. But if you all could jump onto that Padlet, I put the link in the chat.
And while you're doing that, I want to emphasize that this is a place in this whole inquiry process, right at the start, when the kids are starting to formulate their questions. Doing this analog, the best way that we found and the most engaging is big sheets of poster paper and some markers. Doing it online is certainly doable, and there's a number of ways to kind of utilize the technology, but we very much recognize that, or recommend that this be done sort of analog. Get some markers, get some big pieces of poster paper, and have the kids work on those.
So this Padlet is set up. This is just one way that you could do it. By the way, I work a little bit with Right Question Institute, and we tried a bunch of different ways, doing it through like Pear Deck and Google Slides, or just on Google Docs, or different ways. But this seems to work pretty well. The way this particular one is set up is separated by days. You wouldn't need to do that. It just kind of depends on the time of what you're doing. But this is one way that it could be set up. If you're not familiar with Padlet, Padlet is really nice because it's really user friendly. You can just double click anywhere and you create like a little post. They're all set up essentially the same way, with a bold title and then some text, and you can add links if you want to. So Padlet works pretty nicely for this. So I'm going to take you through an abbreviated version of the QFT, just so you get that experience. So again, step one is going over the rules with the students, which I read to you earlier, and then talking about why those rules are important, and we want everyone's voices heard. We want as many questions as we can, because even a question that's thrown out that may not end up being a priority question might trigger a thought in someone else that, oh, I hadn't thought of that, and now there's a new line of thinking and question asking. So we want as many questions as we can, and we want everyone to feel safe to ask those questions. Then you go over the Q focus, and again, this is the one piece that you as the teacher need to provide, and you want to, something related to whatever you're leading into. If it's the very first time you're doing a QFT, it could be just something that's fun and engaging. I often use a 360 image taken from the Mars rover, so kids can click around and see different things in the sky and on the ground, and the rover itself, and they ask all kinds of questions. But if you want to do it leading into a unit or something, you would find something that would sort of start triggering thoughts and questions that the students have. One recommendation I have is to test out your Q focus on some other people that won't be participating in the QFT, but family or friends or colleagues, and just see what types of questions you're getting from them, because sometimes you might think this is a perfect thing, and then that Mars rover example, if I was doing a unit on whatever the environment on Mars, and all my questions I'm getting are about the rover itself, maybe the rover is a distraction, and maybe that's not the best image. So test it out.
I just want to interject. There's a rule here. And the rule is that the one thing you can't do when you're formulating your question focus is you can't ask a question. So this is not a question. It could be a video, it could be a picture, a word, a short passage. It can be all sorts of things, anything you can come up with that'll stimulate some thinking around what it is you want the kids to focus on. But the one thing you don't do is don't write a question.
Yep. Thank you. Okay, so you present the Q focus, which in our case here, it's going to be those global goals that we looked at earlier. And then you give them 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be 5 minutes. It could be longer. It could be shorter. Sometimes it depends on the age of the students. I did this with third graders, and after 5 minutes, they had very few questions. So I needed to give them a lot more time. In the interest of time here, we'll probably do a little less than 5 minutes. But using the Padlet, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a little bit of time to take a look at the Q focus, the global goals, and then we're going to ask you to come up with as many questions as you can. And again, you can just click anywhere over here. There's plenty of space over here on the right side of the Padlet to the right of step 3. Just double click anywhere. You're going to type your question up here. And then down below, just put your initials. Otherwise, it's anonymous, but just as a way to keep track. And when you're doing this with students, then they can find their own posts. But so go ahead and I'm going to put the Q focus up a little larger on the screen, but we're going to give you all 5 minutes or less to come up with as many questions as you can related to this Q focus. So it could be about the global goals in general. It could be about some of the specific global goals on here. It'd be questions that you're having in relation to how you might use these in your context. Any questions that you have related to these global goals. So we'll give you a few minutes to come up, and any question that pops in your mind, go ahead and put it on the Padlet. So I see we have a few questions on the Padlet. I encourage you all to add at least one question on there. And it can be anything related to those global goals, where they came from, what a specific one means, how you would use this in English class, or how you'd use this with kindergartners. So someone asked where are the questions on the Padlet. So if just to the right of step 3 over here, if you just double click anywhere, then you can add a question. If you're not seeing them, there might be this little update. If I click update, it'll sort of refresh it, or you could just refresh the page yourself. But you should see some of these popping up. Someone also mentioned that you can still do the QFT. You can still do in small groups by using breakout rooms, which, yeah, you definitely could do that. All right, so continue to add questions. By the way, if you are using this built-in timer, when I refresh the page, then it restarted the timer. So keep that in mind. But if we were doing this on poster paper in groups and they're writing them down, we usually end up, in 5 minutes with 8 to 15 questions or something that the group comes up with. So continue to add questions. I'm going to go over the next steps. Again, this is broken up by day, which you would not have to do. That's just how this particular one was set up. The next step, well, doing it here on the Padlet, is to then go back and read the other ones, because when you're physically in a group, people are saying them out loud, so you're hearing the other questions of your group already. But since we're just typing here, you may not have read everyone else's, so you would go back and read them. And then here's where we're now going to start to look to improve those questions. And the first step of that is labeling the questions as open-ended or closed-ended. The first time or two that you do this, you might have a discussion with the students about what is an open-ended and closed-ended question. In general, closed-ended questions can be answered with a yes or a no or a one-word answer. And in general, open-ended questions can't be answered with one word. They require more of an explanation. You also would talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both. The idea isn't that closed-ended questions are bad and open-ended questions are good. There's a time and a place for both. But we do want students to start thinking about those questions, especially as they're coming up with questions for, inquiry projects that most likely will need to be an open-ended question. So that they would go back and label them with a C or an O, which you could do as like a comment on the Padlet. On the poster paper, usually they just write a C or an O right next to the question. And then as a group, you would improve the questions by converting one of each. So you would take one of the open-ended questions that your group came up with and make it into a closed-ended question, and then take one closed-ended question and convert it to an open-ended question, which can be challenging at first for the students. Here on the Padlet, you could do it just by adding a comment underneath and converting, an individual question from how is it to is it or something, right? So we're not gonna do those steps together right now. I'm gonna jump to day 3, the bottom section here. So step 6 is prioritizing the question. So this is where you're gonna come up as a group or as a class with your priority questions. A reason this works nicely on the Padlet is you can turn on reactions. So you can see in the bottom left, there's a little heart with a number. So if you all could go and click the little heart on 3 priority questions, 3 questions that you find most important, usually is the word that we use. It depends how you're using the question. So here we can say just 3 questions that you find most interesting, or 3 questions you would like to know an answer to. We're not actually going to do anything with these questions, but just go ahead and click the heart on 3 of them that you find that resonate with you.
Yeah, and let me comment. Here's the critical part for how this sets up the rest of the inquiry work that our students would do. Kids have come up with a big list of questions, 15, 20 questions, let's say. This step about them prioritizing these questions so that they have conversations about which are the most important questions that we wrote down. As they do that, if you take the top X number of questions that they generated, say 5, just arbitrary number, those 5 questions become the driving questions that they need to research and learn about and get the information on. And then with those 5 questions and the information that they put together, that's the product that they're going to start to work on and share the learning that they've done on whatever it is that we started this focus with in the first place. So this step of prioritizing is how basically they're going to sort of draft their outline of what research work they're going to begin to work on.
So just for the sake of our groups, I'm seeing the 5, 4, and 3 look like the top ones. So based on our group, these would be our priority questions. So how is decent work and economic growth measured? What is quality education? and how can we harness the sun to effectively use the energy instead of fossil fuels? So then those would be our priority questions that we'll talk about what you might do with those questions in a second. Just finishing off the QFT process. So you might look at those priority questions you came up with and then discuss next steps for finding answers to those questions. Is it something you can look up online? Is there more research that would need to be done? Do you need to interview someone? How are we going to find the answers to these questions? And then the final step is a reflection, which in class you can have students do it, writing it down or sharing it out loud, or using some other tool like Flipgrid or something. On the Padlet itself, you can add reflections just by adding a post right here, or there's Padlet has a bunch of different ways that you can share things. So you could record your audio of you giving a reflection. You could record yourself in video. You could just type it in. You could add a fun GIF or something representative of your reflection. So the reflection step is important at the end as well. So coming back here, so another thing that we're big fans of are Trevor McKenzie's Dive into Inquiry is the name of his book. And in that book, he uses this pool metaphor for the stages of inquiry. It's not a good idea to just try and start at free inquiry where you just throw kids in the deep end and they're coming up with questions and finding answers, because they're going to end up getting lost or metaphorically drowning in the deep end here. So his book does a really good job of taking you through the different steps, slowly releasing the agency to the students. It also does a really good job of giving real classroom examples. Trevor is still a classroom teacher. He teaches English up in Canada and taught through the pandemic. So so this might be a way that you're going to use your questions that you got from the QFT process, and you might start using those questions in a structured inquiry manner, controlled inquiry, guided inquiry, and then eventually to the point where students are coming up with their own questions and seeking answers to those questions.
And spoiler, just from a pragmatic standpoint, our recommendation, just like we were talking with Sonny Magana's work, get to T2 as soon as you can. In this model, get to guided inquiry as soon as you can. And that's what we think is the sweet spot about making sure that you're guiding the students into focusing on the content that you want them to, but in a way that gives them the voice and the agency and the flexibility to explore that in multiple ways. But guided inquiry is kind of the central sort of place where you want to find that sweet spot. Even in schools like Science Leadership Academy that have been doing inquiry for years and years, it's not until the final semester of the senior year that free inquiry becomes part of the process that they do. Getting from guided inquiry to free inquiry for high school level kids literally takes almost 4 years. So guided inquiry is that's your bullseye. Try to get there as soon as you can.
So thinking about that pool metaphor as we look at the priority questions that we just came up with through the QFT process. So you might start sort of in a structured inquiry situation where the class is doing an inquiry project together as a group. So you might take the number one priority question that you came up with as a class. And if you did do it in smaller groups, you might then collect all of those questions that the groups came up with and then give the whole class an opportunity to pick their priority question. And then you might just use that one question as a driving question for a class inquiry project. So that would be sort of that structured inquiry approach. You then may, as a class, come up with your top 3 or 5 priority questions that then students maybe get to choose one of those. So they're having some voice and choice in what their priority question is, but you're still working within a limited scope. You might do that same thing, but then students are choosing a priority question and working in a group with other students that pick that same priority question, and they're working collaboratively on coming up with an answer or solution to that question. And then working all the way up to where students are coming up with their own questions and then seeking answers to those questions, solving those wicked problems on things that they are interested in. And then, so what are they doing in their projects? So there's a lot of different things that you can do. And this might be another place that you're bringing in voice and choice for students, but maybe you build up to that. It could be that they're writing a research paper based on their findings. It could be that they're, just creating a presentation, Google Slides or whatever tool you're using. I really like doing a combination of, like Google Slides with a screencasting tool. We use Screencastify, so they can create a presentation and then present that, recording themselves using a screencasting tool. And the nice thing is, maybe you're not taking up a whole period or multiple periods of kids coming up and doing presentations. Maybe you collect them and then they're available for students to watch. And that gets into Sunny's T2, where they're the contribution level where they're learning from each other. So they might be answering different questions, but then they're able to learn from each other. But then also they have an artifact that lives on, and they can share that video with family or whatever. Creating a video with some other video creation tool like WeVideo or something like that you might have in your district. It could be that they're developing a prototype. So maybe the question or the problem that they came up with needs, there's something new that needs to be created to answer that question or solve that problem. So they might be creating a prototype and then potentially sharing that. Or it could be that, doing some sort of coding, creating an app or something is a way to answer that question or solve that problem.
And just to comment about whatever mode that you choose for the students to present their learning and share what they've done, the wider the audience, the better. If the kids are just working for you, that's at one level. But if the kids are going to publish this and share it for a wider audience, then the commitment that they're going to have to the quality of that outcome is going to be deeper. So the wider you can make the audience for the students, the better. The inquiry project that I alluded to at Science Leadership Academy is the senior capstone project, is a presentation in public at the Franklin Institute in their large theater. And anybody is welcome to show up. So parents, family shows up, scientists show up, other educators. SLA has been doing this long enough now that it's sort of a community-wide event. But if you can get people from outside of your sphere to show up to hear what the kids have to share, that really helps the kids in their commitment to their work and sharing their learning.
And if you don't have access to the Franklin Institute, you can also have a parent night, or we had a teacher that did a global goals project. They worked in groups, and then just in the gym, they all had set up, and classes came together, got to share their work. And that's it for us. So please feel free to reach out if you have any questions or anything you want to share. That link is to the slides for the presentation. I'll put that in the chat. I also want to put in a shameless plug for Gold Coast Q event that we're going to have the first week of August. We're going to have a whole bunch of great presenters, sessions throughout the day. They'll all be recorded, so you can come back and watch them anytime. And our focus is to take the lessons learned from the last year and a half and not revert back to normal, but instead to make real change. Our session strands are focused on grading and assessment, inquiry and PBL, SEL and wellness, equity, and student-centered learning. So our sched is not quite up yet. Hopefully we'll have that up next week, by next week, but the Eventbrite is up if that's something that you're interested in. So I will put the link to that in as well. So thank you all for joining us. Here's the link to Roxnard, and Here's the link to our slides.
I got that one in there, Jay.
Oh, cool. So,
And for the record, I got the Rocksnard one in too. but
okay.
You beat me to it.
My Rocksnard one's clickable though, so it's even better.
I don't know what to say about that, other than, yeah, it's true.
All right. Well, thanks.